Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us in today's webinar. I'm your host, Caitlin Cormier. Have you ever found yourself wondering, what should I invest in? And then having no idea how to get started with your research? Or maybe you start digging down into the data only to get lost in a rabbit hole of research and end up feeling uncertain about which investment to choose. Well, thankfully, there are plenty of tools on WebBroker that can help investors research investment ideas and decide between them. And today, we're going to unpack some of them. Here with us is my colleague Nugwa Haruna, Senior Client Education Instructor at TD Direct Investing. She's going to demonstrate how to use some of those research tools and share specific situations where they might come in handy. Nugwa, thanks for taking the time.
I'm so excited, so thanks so much for having me.
Now, there are so many ways to research investment ideas on WebBroker, far more than we can cover in a single conversation. So what we're going to do is run through a handful of potential scenarios and explain some approaches for investors to consider. Okay, Nugwa, let's say I'm an investor just starting my research. I'm not sure what investment theme or individual securities to consider. Where could I consider beginning my search in WebBroker?
So, just as you mentioned, Caitlin, investing in itself can be intimidating, especially for an investor who's just starting their journey as a self-directed investor. So, what we're going to do is we're going to show how WebBroker makes it so easy for you to research and find research ideas once you start trading. So, the first place that type of investor who's looking for ideas where they could go is they could go under the tab that says Research. And we're going to start off by going under the Overview tab. Now, what this does is it gives us an idea of the market and an overview of the markets. So, for instance, if I'm that kind of investor who, on the news, you're always hearing the markets are up today, the markets are down today, and you want to know what exactly is going on, how up are they today, how down are the markets today, you can get that information by actually just taking a look at the markets overview page here. It gives you information on how the markets are trending during the day. It will also give you a summary of information such as what different sectors are performing well today and which ones are not doing so well. You'll be able to pull up information like news reports. That's all summarized on this page. For an investor as well who is interested in, let's say, the Canadian markets or the US markets, you have the option to toggle back and forth between these markets. So for instance, let's say I'm more interested in the Canadian markets, I can toggle back to a market overview for the Canadian markets. I can also, while I'm on this page, decide which major markets I want to see information about. So right now I'm able to see information about the TSX Composite, which tracks the performance of the 250 or around that number publicly traded companies in Canada. And I can decide to edit what I'm seeing on here. So when I click on the edit button, I can decide maybe I want to change the information I'm seeing from the NASDAQ, and instead maybe I want to see information about the TSX Venture. I can save that information and that is updated. So this is just one way an investor could find out what's going on with the markets, which major markets are performing well, which ones are not doing so great. Now, if you want to dig a little deeper into some information about these markets and how they're performing relative to each other over a certain amount of time, that investor can go ahead and use the Indices tab. So this Indices tab will show an investor information, as I mentioned, of how these markets are doing relative to each other. So, for instance, if I'm still trying to decide, maybe I want to invest in the Canadian markets, or maybe I want to invest in the US markets. I haven't made up my mind. Well, I could potentially use this mini chart that's showing on here. What we have as a default would be the TSX Composite and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average is an index that tracks the performance of 30 prominent companies that trade in the United States. And I can see over time how these two markets have performed compared to each other. So an investor who says, well, I want to see a little more, some more markets, not just these two. Well, you are able to just scroll down. And let's say I decide I want to add the NASDAQ, which is an index that tracks about 3,000 companies that trade on the NASDAQ exchange. And let's say maybe I also want to add the S&P 500. So I'm going to scroll back up. And once I do that, as an investor, I can see how all these markets are trending compared to each other. If I'm also concerned about a longer time frame, I could change that information and say, okay, on a 5-year basis, how are they comparing? What is the trend that I'm seeing? How are they responding to different economical situations that are happening in the economy? And this could help me make a decision as I'm looking for investment ideas. Now, something else an investor could do is, let's say I change this to a 1 day time frame. If I'm more interested in the short term, I can see how these markets are performing today. So for instance, if I take a look at this and I'm more interested in Canadian markets, so let's say the TSX composite, I can see that it is down along with all the other markets. It's not as down as the rest of them. I can now focus on the right side of my screen. I'll scroll down. And on here, if I select the TSX composite, I can see the companies that have performed the best today. So the markets are still open. So I'm seeing the companies that are performing the best today. And I can also pull up an article to tell me the reason why this company, for instance, is up 7.37% today. Now, if I want to get some more detailed information about, why certain companies are performing the way they are, or if I have a sector that I'm looking into, I want to look into, I can go to the tab that gives me information on news and commentary for what's happening in the markets. So let's say I want to know how crude oil is doing, what the news about crude oil is, how it's impacting the markets. I can actually just type in a keyword I'm thinking of. So once I search for crude oil, I can see, once again, based on the Canadian markets, any information that mentions crude oil and how it's affecting the economy as a whole. If I had a specific company in mind, and let's say for this example, I'm thinking of Suncor, I'm able to type that in as well, and any news or any information about Suncor, when Suncor was mentioned, will actually pop up here. On the right as well, there's some video commentary from Money Talk, which is brought to you by TD. There's commentary from Morningstar research firm. If I'm not interested in watching videos, then I can read different short articles by Globe and Mail. These articles will have information such as what the major market movers are today and why they're causing such a shift in the economy. So these are some of the things that an investor who's first starting out can utilize.
All right, great. So it's kind of starting big scale and kind of finding a way to find some ideas from there. So that's great. Now, what if I'm a stock picker and I'm on the hunt for some specific names to consider? So where could I go to get those names?
Right. So, as an investor, you get a lot of information thrown at you when you go online, when you turn on the TV, and you may want to dig a little deeper into some of this information. You are able to do that by using the reports tab that we have in the markets under our markets tab. Now, what this does is you have access to reports by the TD analyst, you have access to reports by third party analysts such as Argus, such as Morningstar. And these reports are published throughout the day. They could be published daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. So if you want to see the most up-to-date information, you would be on the tab that says current. But if you're looking for a trend, and let's say you're looking at a report that is published weekly and you want to see a trend for the last few weeks, you can actually pull up the archived version of these reports. So you do have access to that. So let's take a look at one of these reports and how an investor could actually utilize them. So let's say an investor decides they want to utilize the TD SI action list report. Now, this report is put together by the TD analyst. And so part of what the TD analysts will do is they will look at different sectors and they will have what they would consider their favorite picks or what they call their action list buy. An investor is able to pull up this information. We're just going to go to the page that has this here. We have different analysts that follow different sectors. And for each specific sector, an analyst might have what they call an action list buy. So you're able to look at each sector, see the company, see what its rating is. An investor is also able to see what the share price was when this report was generated, as well as what the analyst projects the share price will be in 12 months. Now, there's something else that an investor could do. As I mentioned, these reports are created monthly. Every quarter, there is a report that is generated that has a full list of every company in that sector that the analyst is tracking. And an investor is able to utilize that information to find trends about what the analyst recommendations are for specific companies in a specific sector. Another place an investor could go would be under the Analyst Center. So what the Analyst Center does is we have a group of different analysts. We have the most recent ratings from different analysts from different companies and what their ratings are for those companies. So for instance, if I'm an investor and I also want to be sure that the analyst information I'm collecting, I'm comfortable with it, I can actually decide to pull up the rating for the analyst. So yes, the analysts are rated from 1 to 5 stars, so out of 5 stars. So if I want, I could decide I only want to see ratings by 5 or 4 star analysts. And if I'm only interested in ratings for companies in the United States, I can filter that down. Or let's say I'm only interested in ratings for technology companies, I can filter that information down as well. Some investors like to follow specific analysts. So if I do have analysts I'm following because I trust their recommendations, I can actually pull up information for those analysts I'm following, pull up any of their more recent recommendations, and then I can start my research from there. So this is just some of the information that an investor could utilize during their research.
Let's say I'm building mutual funds or exchange traded funds into my portfolio. What tools are there to help me find funds that might suit my needs and then choose between them?
So sometimes investors who are starting out may say, you know what, it might take a lot for me to actually build my portfolio from scratch, choose individual investments. I just want something that has been put together for me. So that could be the reason why some investors may decide to use mutual funds and or exchange traded funds, where these are put together by a money manager. And so what they do is they will collect different companies. So it could be, for instance, Canadian banks. That fund manager will put together a fund that holds Canadian banks and investors can buy them. So an investor who's looking for information on, let's say, mutual funds, exchange traded funds, is able to find them by clicking on the research tab. Under investments, you have mutual funds or exchange traded funds. Let's start with ETFs. Now, once on this page, on the left side of this page, an investor could actually find the top and bottom performing categories. Now, these categories will be made up of funds that have similar objectives or similar holdings. So, for instance, if I was searching for the best categories to start off with, I'd be able to see that the top performing category in the last 1 year for ETFs would be energy holding ETFs, and there's 14 of them. So I could start exploring this information from here. Something else I could do is if I'm more interested in something that's longer than a year, maybe I'm more of a long-term investor. So I want to see the behavior of these funds over a more longer term. I'm just going to scroll up and I have the option to click on categories over here. So I'm going to go there. And once I come here, this will give me all the ETF categories. And so once again, I could either decide I want to see a 1 year performance, or maybe I want to see a longer term performance. I'm going to change this to a 5 year performance. So what category has performed the best over the last 5 years? And then I'll see that this, for instance, gives me the US equity ETF category, and there's 165 funds, and I can start to explore from there. So this is using exchange traded funds. If I'm more interested, let's say mutual funds, I'm going to go research and I'm going to click on mutual funds. The idea is the same, where on the main overview page for mutual funds, I can find that information for the best performing on my bottom left here. And if I want to dig a little deeper, I can go into the categories. But one more step that I'd be able to find would be under the analyst choice funds. And essentially what this is that we have TD mutual fund analysts have actually put together different mutual funds that they essentially call their picks. And an investor can filter this by, if you're more interested in how these funds are rated for their risk to return. If I'm an investor who's more interested in the fees that these funds are charging, or if I'm an investor who's more concerned about how much do these funds pay? So how much do they pay out in dividends? How much do they pay out in interest? I'm able to utilize this information out of the TD mutual fund analyst picks. So this is a way an investor could get started researching mutual funds and exchange traded funds.
I love that. So if you want to take a little bit of the work out, you don't want to pick those individual stocks, you could put some of that in the hands of an investment manager and just do a little bit less research on the mutual fund and ETF side. So what about if we have an investor who's looking to minimize fees that we pay on funds? How can I find funds that would fit that bill?
So if you want to take the time to filter through some of that, we're going to go back to the overview page here. And once I come here, now I'm going to focus on the right side of the screen and I'm going to scroll down. There is a quick screen tool I can use to filter for funds that, for instance, will potentially charge a lower management fee compared to others. So let's choose a fund category for the purposes of this example. I'm going to go fund category. And for this example, I'm just going to choose, let's say we pick Canadian equity. Right off the bat, it tells me there's 133 mutual funds that are in the Canadian equity category. Now, if I want to filter and say amongst these funds, which ones charge the lower management expense ratio? I could start off by using the criteria of management expense ratio. I'm going to click on that. And this will allow me say, okay, with all of these Canadian equity funds, which ones charge the lowest MER, or let's say on average, which ones are average in terms of their fees? I'm going to click on that. And it tells me there's 19. I can start my search from here, scrolling down, and I can view my 19 matches. Alternatively, I'm going to clear this because some investors may decide that instead what they want to use is they want to take advantage of the D and E series funds. So to tell you a little bit about the D and E series funds, these are low cost funds. The D series ones are funds that are created specifically for self-directed investors. The E series funds are also low maintenance funds, and they are created and they track certain indices. So there's also a lot of low maintenance there. So they tend to have a lower management expense ratio. So an investor could say, okay, I want to just look at D and E series funds. I'm going to click on that. I will scroll down. There's 20 matches and we're going to take a look at those. So once I pull up these 20 mutual funds, I'm going to uncheck this. I can decide I want to see a little more information about each of these funds. So I'm going to go on to summary. Now I'll see a breakdown of all 20 funds and I can see some additional things. So even within these potential low cost funds, I can still filter for the ones with the lowest costs, and I can use this filter, and I can do that for any of these. I can also decide to compare these funds, how they've performed performance-wise over a time frame. So these are the different tools that I could utilize if I'm an investor who's more concerned about fees, or let's say I want to check out the performance of funds.
Now, you can find more out about choosing between funds in our video course, Investing in ETFs and Mutual Funds, which is available on demand in the Learning Center. So let's say I've heard about a specific stock on social media or TV, for instance, and I want to do my own research on it. What are some of the tools available to help me size it up?
So for an investor who wants to find out the valuation of these companies, potentially dig a little deeper into how these companies are performing, they're able to do that in WebBroker. We're going to click on research. And this time under investments, we're going to go stocks. And once we come over here, we will, for this example, we're going to focus on the fundamentals. So one of the things that an investor who is interested in digging a little deeper into how companies are valued, how companies are performing, they could use the fundamentals tab here, because what the fundamentals tab will give you would be how this company is performing, and you could say relative to the industry as a whole. So for instance, an investor could say, I want to see what the earnings of this company are, and how does it tie up to the industry as a whole. Another thing an investor could look at is the price to earnings ratio, where the price to earnings ratio tells you for every dollar you're paying, what are the earnings of the company. And I want to see how that measures up compared to the rest of the industry. Now, if you decide, okay, I actually want to see this company compared to its closest peers, how is it performing? That investor could potentially use the peer comparison tab. And then it shows that investor earnings, once again, compared to its closest peers, price to earnings ratio compared to its closest peers. If an investor wants to dig a little deeper, even more, they can check out the financial statements of these companies, where you can pull up concise information such as the income statement, the balance sheet, as well as the cash flow statement. So let's say there's an investor who says, this is great information, but I don't know how to analyze this information. How do I use this information? Well, that investor could potentially decide to use the analyst tab. So what the analyst tab does is that there's different analysts who have rated these companies. And that investor is able to say, okay, I want to see how many analysts have rated this company and what exactly these analysts are saying about this company. The investor may also want to take a look and see what is the high that these analysts are projecting in the next 12 months, what is the low they're projecting in the next 12 months. And then you could say, who exactly are these analysts? And this investor can scroll a little lower and see who these analysts are, what their ratings are for the company. And if they want, they can follow these analysts from here. Now, one more question an investor could potentially ask is, why are these analysts saying, for instance, buy? Or why is another analyst saying sell? I want to dig a little deeper. Why do they come up with these recommendations? Well, an investor is able to click on reports. And under the reports tab, you can actually see reports by the analysts. So you can see reports by the TD analysts as well as third-party analysts. So for instance, if I want to see what the Morningstar analysts are saying about this specific company, their information about the fundamentals, where if they think the company is overvalued, reasonably priced, undervalued, they are, you as an investor, you're able to pull up that information as well. So quite a wealth of information an investor could potentially use if they're thinking of using something like fundamental analysis.
Yes, lots of information there. So, to learn more about the basics of fundamental analysis and valuation metrics, catch our video course Intro to Fundamental Analysis, which is in the Learning Center. Okay, what if I have an investment theme in mind and I only want to look at stocks that fit that specific criteria? So, let's say stocks that are consistently growing their earnings for the purpose of this demo. What can I do to narrow my search?
Right? So, and that's a question investors would have. We just talked about how an investor could potentially see what the earnings per share of a company are. But what we looked at was at a snapshot in time. So I'm looking, let's say an investor is looking for a trend, right? So maybe the earnings per share of this company may look really good now, but has it always looked good? Is it trending in the direction the investor is interested in? Well, that investor could dig a little deeper by using the screeners tool. So you can find that on the research, and under tools, we will click on screeners. So to tell you a little bit about the screeners tool, you can think about it almost as a real estate website where if you're looking to buy a home, you can pull up information about homes, but you might find thousands that don't meet your needs. But if you put in certain criteria, you're able to narrow down what you're shown. And that's the same idea behind the screeners tool, where I can say there's thousands of companies out there, but I only want this information, and I only want companies that meet this information. So to your question about, let's say an investor is looking for a trend in, let's say, growth in the earnings per share of a company. Once you pull up your screeners tool, we're going to click on screening. And once we're here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a screen. Right now, there's over 8,400 stocks here. That's a little too much information for us. So we're going to clear all. And now we're going to create a screen. We're going to go more criteria. And what we're going to do in this situation is, let's say we want to see a company that has grown its earnings per share over a 5-year period. So I'm going to click on earnings per share growth, 5-year historical. And once I do that, we have the ability to set minimum and maximum growth that we're looking for. So for the purposes of this example, I'm going to set the minimum as 0. So we want a company that at least has not seen a decrease in its earnings per share. Once you do that, there's 2,100 companies that match our needs. Let's add a little more criteria here. Let's say for purposes of this example, we just want companies in a specific sector. And so this time I could say, well, I just want this to show me information for companies just in the financial sector. All right. And then one final thing is, maybe I'm just interested in Canadian companies. So I'm going to go under exchange. This investor could say, I just want companies that trade on the Canadian exchange. And once that investor does that, there's 78 companies that meet that criteria, and I can just scroll down and find those 78 matches. So that's how an investor is able to just filter through and find companies that meet a specific criteria.
I like that real estate comparison there. Very interesting. Put in kind of what you're looking for and then see what the results what show you, see what's there. Sometimes an investor might have a theme in mind, but they don't know which specific criteria to consider. So, where can they go to get some help?
Right. So we just put together, I would call it like a recipe that maybe works for that investor where they can dig a little deeper and find out what analysts are saying about each of these companies. But what if you don't want to start from scratch? Well, that investor is able to use the Discover tab that we have here. Now, under this, this investor is able to find different themes, different screens. So it's almost like a curated list is already created. Now, the first thing you could look at is if I'm an investor who's more environmentally conscious, so I want to see companies that are ESG rated. I'm, for instance, able to click on the theme for ESG stocks. And one of the things about this is that even though it's already created, I can still do a little bit of more filtering. So for instance, it's 252 matches. It might be that might be a lot of stocks for me to go through. I can decide to filter and make it just Canadian companies, and that will bring down my number to 47. So going back to our Discover tool here, an investor can also use preset screens. Now the preset screens are made from the most popular criteria investors tend to use. It could be top performers, top dividend payers. So if an investor wants to utilize this information, just pull up screeners that have already been created, they can use that. Finally, an investor could actually use the expert strategy screens. Now, these ones are created by Trade Central. Trade Central are the company that provides this strategy builder to us. And so these experts have put together different screens. So for instance, the most recent one that we have on here would be for high flying technological stocks. So an investor can look at the 25 matches to see if that's something that meets their needs.
So, if you do want a more detailed guide on the screeners tool, you can watch our webinar, How to Sharpen Your Search with Custom Screeners, featuring Gary Christie from Trading Central. What about if I found an investment idea that I like, but I don't want to trade it until it reaches a certain pricing level? How might I track it without a lot of time and effort?
There's times when you're just watching a stock or potentially watching a number of stocks of securities and you haven't made up your mind. So an investor is able to do that using the alerts feature. So to find that, you'll find that here right on any security. So I'm going to pull up the alerts. And this is where an investor who, let's say you're on the go, because as we know, you're working potentially 9 to 5. You might not have the opportunity to be in front of your computer consistently to watch the markets. That investor could potentially use the alerts feature. And one of the things about this alert feature is also available on the TD mobile app as well. So an investor could potentially use that. Now, if you wanted to do things like identify when there's a price drop or when there's a price increase, it could be because maybe I want to identify a price drop because I may be holding a security, and according to me, I may think that if the price of that stock reaches a certain amount, it might go into a free fall. Or I may be an investor who essentially wants to potentially buy low and sell high. If I'm any of these kinds of investors, I could set a price here, and then I could decide that I want to receive an alert either by email or on my mobile device. Now, in order to receive the notification on a mobile device, you will need to make sure you have the TD app installed on there and have the notifications activated. And that investor is potentially able to receive push notifications when any of these alerts are triggered.
Nugwa, this is fantastic. Thanks so much for showing us all these resources in WebBroker. And if you're looking for additional walkthroughs of all the WebBroker has to offer, check out our video course, WebBroker Essentials in the Learning Center. Now, let's bring our audience into the discussion over on our live Q&A.